So this talk is pretty much directly from a recently published paper in Africa Journal of Marine Science, evaluating the evidence for ecological effectiveness of South Africa's marine protected areas. Why evaluate effectiveness? Well, there's increasing need to justify the existence of marine protected areas and further expansion of marine protected areas by providing evidence as to whether they actually are effective. And this is considering increasing demand for resources from different sectors, and associated with this, increasing opposition to marine protected areas from some sources. And then also, of course, determining the extent to which MPAs meet the objectives and determining gaps in MPAs are essential for adaptive management and planning, and so on. We consider the main components of protected area effectiveness that need to be taken into account according to the literature. In the bottom left panel here, these include design issues, management related issues, and also delivery against goals and objectives, although we focus mainly on the latter. In terms of scale, we consider from the individual MPA up to the whole MPA network. In terms of function, we considered only the sort of ecological, or also known as protection aspect. Socioeconomic and governance functions are dealt with in related papers. We conducted a literature survey of 140 relevant South African papers and theses and reports, as well as additional international studies to provide context. Information from the South African papers was summarized into vast tables that are provided as supplementary material to the paper. It's mainly a review paper, but we use some novel classifications and analyses to complement the review and assist in identifying patterns or here's an excerpt of the supplementary tables showing the MPA. On the left, the name of the MPA that was the focus of each reviewed paper, summarizing the details of each study, including the species or community that we looked at, and the outcomes, which are categorized on the right as either positive or negative, or also neutral or inconclusive. Those are the zeros, in terms of the various parameters that were considered to assess effectiveness. So we were looking for quantifiable changes in parameters such as abundance, size of organisms, reproductive output of populations or communities, and other parameters that you see there that were derived from comparisons made inside versus outside marine protected areas, or before and after proclamation of MPAs, in order to assess the ecological effects of the MPAs. The top panel of the graph here summarized results for several key parameters, including abundance, which also includes biomass or catch per unit effort, size of organisms, age, growth rate, and others. The positive aspects are orange on the graph, the negative are blue, and this is for species, studies of species. In 64% of the cases, effects of the MPA were shown that were interpreted as positive effects, manifest as increases in one or more of these parameters. Effects were neutral, which are white here in the graph, in 31% of cases, and negative in only 5%. As I said, those are for species. Effects were more ambiguous when we looked at community effects. That's the lower graph here, but still changes were found to be positive in about half of the cases. So overall, the majority of studies recorded beneficial effects of the MPAs. And generally negative effects, where they occurred, they were attributed to failure of compliance or to unsuitable habitat in the MPA for the species concerned, or to ecosystem effects, such as can be brought about by increased competition or predation within the MPA due to the greater abundance of those species that are protected, or the species being protected there. We summarize here the different types of studies that were available in terms of a framework for ecological effects of MPAs previously provided by Ali Goods and his co-workers. Most of the studies that we assessed, that we looked at, assessed differences in population parameters inside versus outside the MPA, such as those I've shown in the previous slides. That equates to step 2 of their framework here, which is illustrated by the tall green bar in the graph on the right. The other steps, which are steps 3 to 6 here, have been applied with declining frequency. Few studies have looked for ecosystem effects or evaluated spillover of the MPA products that can benefit fisheries outside the MPA. And very few studies have gone as far as assessing whether fisheries have actually benefited from an MPA, although those that did so, that did look at this, did show positive results. That is the bar on the far right there, number 6 on the graph. So this helps to highlight gaps for further study effectiveness. And then we also highlight more gaps, further gaps, by considering the type of organisms that were looked at and in which marine protected areas. Most studies were focused on fish species, and secondly on invertebrates, especially intertidal species. Not surprising, because protection from exploitation is one of the main purposes of most MPAs, so naturally these are the groups to look at if you want to see MPA effects. And there's been few relevant studies on other groups, or such as algal species like kelp, what we call iconic species, including threatened seabirds and turtles. And we see in the graph on the left that there's a clear bias of studies to some marine protected areas and some others that have been largely neglected in research and monitoring. So typically the ones where there have been little or no relevant studies are smaller MPAs, or don't include any sort of no-take area really within them. So those were the outcome-related aspects for the individual MPAs. Looking at more design and process-related elements to assess the adequacy and viability of individual sites, we made use of a framework provided by the 5 Naoli features in a well-known nature study by Edgar and his colleagues in 2014. Their paradigm specifies an MPA should be no-take, well-enforced, more than 10 years old, greater than 100 square kilometers in size, and be isolated, for example, by deep water or sand. And according to the paradigm, an MPA would need to score highly in at least 4 of the 5 features to be effective. We applied these features to South Africa's MPAs just as an exercise that can help identify where improvement can be made in design and management, with some adaptations of the original features to fit the context better. There's not time present to there's no time to present these results in detail, but only 4 MPAs, those on the right, scored highly in terms of 4 of the 5 features. These were the same MPAs for which the most ecological effects have been shown, whereas those that scored lowest were generally the same ones that have so far been underrepresented in research and monitoring. Increasing no-take areas and the size of some of these MPAs would certainly enhance their adequacy and viability. And enforcement, which is the black segment on the graph, was found to be the feature that scored lowest on average for MPAs, although this was based on a relatively subjective evaluation process, the enforcement part of it. This is considered to be a realistic reflection of enforcement of our marine protected areas. Moving more to the network scale, considering ecological representativity, all 6 of our marine ecoregions are now represented in the marine protected area network, following the declaration of 20 new areas under protection in 2019. And also 87% of the 150 ecosystem types that have been mapped are represented. So our ecological representativity is relatively good compared to what it was, but 70% of ecosystem types are not well protected, which generally means that less than 20% of them are in MPAs. And this also, of course, includes that there's 13% that are still as yet unprotected. Therefore, there's still work to be done to be more fully representative, with offshore slope and abyssal regions of the east and west coast obviously underrepresented, as you can see on the map, as well as coastal areas of the south and west coasts. Very briefly, we used correspondence with ecologically or biologically significant marine areas, or EPSAs as they are known, as indicator of whether our MPAs are securing sites of particular importance for biodiversity and ecosystem services. And in fact, all of our existing MPAs occur within or overlap with EPSAs to some extent. This speaks to the adequacy of the situation of our MPAs generally. The only EPSAs at this stage that are not represented by MPAs are those shown by arrows here. So these are sites of possible future expansion. Connectivity in MPA networks, that relates to the size and spacing of MPAs to facilitate larval dispersal and movements of adults between MPAs. And it's critical for maintaining gene flow and for replenishment of populations following disturbance. There's no time to go into detail here, but the figure illustrates a very simple analysis that highlights MPAs that are both on the small side of things and remote from other MPAs, and therefore poorly connected in the network. These included coastal MPAs of the west and south coasts, supporting the findings of some genetic studies, or what some genetic studies have shown before now. In general, though, we can say that we have much less of a handle on connectivity than other principles for which there are clearer indicators, and it's identified as an area that needs a lot of future research. And then just finally, some reflections to close with. There's a host of evidence upholding the ecological effectiveness of marine protected areas, manifest especially through increases in the abundance and sizes of targeted species compared with their status in unprotected areas or prior to the proclamation of the MPAs. There's justification for further MPA expansion to address issues of representativity, protecting further areas of biodiversity importance, and enhancing the design of existing marine protected areas. Research and monitoring to assess protection outcomes is so far lacking for many marine protected areas, with gaps in particular for some of the smaller coastal MPAs. Features of some smaller coastal MPAs could be enhanced to make them more adequate and viable, for example, zoning as no-take areas. Research is needed to improve understanding of connectivity, especially with regard to smaller coastal MPAs. And then enforcement is an aspect of management effectiveness that needs to be improved generally, but compliance can also be enhanced by addressing socioeconomic considerations in areas impacted by MPAs, and that's going to be a focus of another talk. And thanks for listening.